What's going on, everyone? So today we have a ton to talk about because over the weekend there was actually a set of three different tournaments going on in the UK Games Expo for Star Wars Unlimited on Friday, on Saturday, and on Sunday. And well, if you look here on the standings, you could see that, well, these are some pretty massive tournaments, and this one in particular is 121 players. The second one on Saturday ended up being a let me just go all the way down here, 128 players, and then on Sunday it was a little bit smaller in 114. But this gave us a ton of information on what the meta kind of looks like for Star Wars Unlimited as of this last weekend, because there was a ton of players and we actually got to see some real matchup data where we really haven't been able to see that in a little while. Yes, there's been some small cash tournaments. Yes, there's been some store showdowns. However, a lot of these tournaments and a lot of these store showdowns were a little bit smaller, or in some cases are just kind of like random meta. Like I've seen some store showdowns where they're mostly Palpatine and mostly random like Luke decks, and yeah, those are fine and they could do some work, but it's not necessarily people really trying to, perform in terms of being as competitive as possible. And while these didn't have a huge prize pool or anything like a, 10K, 5K cash tournament, they did have some cool stuff. And of course, a lot of people were here because they are interested in card games in general. So I want to dive in and talk about all of the things that we've kind of saw in these tournaments in terms of meta. And I'll be doing a full breakdown in the next couple of days. I'm going to be putting together a massive spreadsheet breaking down all the matchups and, of course, everything inside of this tournament. So stay tuned for that. But let's just talk about the baseline here. And if you're interested in picking up any of the cards today that we're going to talk about, be sure to use my TCG Play link in the description down below. And let's dive into it. So we have a ton of information here, and I could spend multiple hours going through it all. But as I mentioned, I want to break them down because we have multiple days of tournaments. I think it's more important in a later video to go ahead and put all the statistics together in one simple format so that we could read them all. But in terms of what I want to go through today is, of course, the meta breakdown. We're seeing a bunch of different decks. I wanted to go over some of the most popular ones that actually have a reasonable sample size, not like the one of Chewbacca or one of IG-88 necessarily, as of course we're going to see all the leaders, generally speaking, get some sort of representation over the course of time because people just want to play them. But in terms of what the actual top of the meta looks like across the 3 days, and of course, what flavor of those leaders are we actually running? So let's start off here with Boba Fett. And Boba Fett, by far the most popular deck, clearly taking the lion's share of the deck breakdowns that we're seeing across all 3 days. And it also had a very respectable win rate at around 54% overall across all 3 days. And because it's the most popular deck and it's holding a 54% win rate, we could definitely safely say that Boba Fett is still one of the top meta players. Now, with what we're seeing with Boba Fett, are we seeing Boba Greens? Are we seeing Boba Yellows? Are we seeing another flavor of Boba? For the most part, across all 3 days, we are seeing Boba Green and Boba Yellow split half and half. You can see here on Friday, we had about almost a straight up 50-50, but we had 50% green and 46% yellow. On Saturday, we had 52% green and 44% yellow with a small amount of blue. And then on Sunday, we had a little bit more crazy things going on. We had about a 40% green, 46% yellow, 12% blue, and 4% Boba Red. For the most part, however, this is a very much Boba Green, Boba Yellow focused meta, and we're going to see it absolutely crush a lot of the different matchups. Some of its most favorable matchups, generally speaking, are going to be things like Sabine, and things like some of the other mid-range decks like Han Solo, Luke. Generally speaking, Boba Fett does pretty well against. So you're going to see that, well, across the board, Boba Fett does take the cake in terms of probably the most popular while also maintaining the most impressive stats. And there's not really any other deck besides Sabine that really puts up the same numbers that we can actually accurately talk about. Okay, how are they situated in the meta? What are their good matchups? What are they doing well on? Because there's not enough decks playing, or none of people playing the other leaders in these tournaments. As for the second most popular, it is by far Sabine. It literally is just the second most popular deck across all 3 days, just the same as Boba Fett. But what type of Sabine are we seeing? Are we seeing Sabine green, Sabine yellow, or Sabine red? You can see on Friday, it was very much a Sabine green focus with about a 62% Sabine green, followed up by a 33% Sabine yellow and a small 6% Sabine red. On Saturday, we saw a little bit more 50-50 split on Sabine green and Sabine yellow, 52-48. And then on the final day, on Sunday, we saw, a little bit more of a 50-50, rather 47-47 split, Sabine green, Sabine yellow, and a small portion of Sabine red. So most of it is Sabine green. That is the more common archetype, but we are seeing a lot of Sabine yellow now, and it's close to becoming about a 50-50 spin on Sabine. Now, in terms of her win rate over the course of 3 days, we're looking at close to about a 50% win rate straight up. And part of that is because Boba Fett's so popular, and Boba Fett, being it so popular, she has a ton of matchups against Boba Fett, which drastically brings down the win rate, generally speaking, across any tournament that we saw. It obviously does really well against a lot of the other decks, such as the slower controlling decks. Usually, Director Krennic or Iron Green, you could just run over with Sabine. And of course, the mid-range strategies like Han Solo or Luke, you generally speaking can move faster than them and get out all of your threats and get in for a ton of damage. This is nothing particularly new, and these decks are, generally speaking, between Boba and Sabine, the most common and things that were more known quantities. Next, in terms of the third most popular one, it was actually Han Solo coming in. Now, day one, it wasn't nearly as popular as some of the other lists, but the other days on day 2 and day 3, or I should say the second event and the third event, we saw Han coming in as the third most popular deck in these tournaments. What are we seeing though? Are we seeing Han green, Han red? For the most part, it's a bunch of Han green. You can see on Friday, we have pretty much a massively dominant, about an 88% Han green with a 12% Han red. And then on Saturday, we're seeing once again a very much focus on Han green with an 82% with a small amount of Han red to follow that up, close to a 20%er. And then on Sunday, once again, we are seeing a very similar spread, except on this day, we had a couple of Han blues coming in order to maybe do a little bit of controlling gameplay for Han. Overall, Han had a very impressive weekend with, I think, as far as my brief look through the statistics already, had the highest win percentage of the decks that had a reasonable sample size over the course of the weekend, with Saturday having a 59%, Sunday having a 54%, and Friday having a 48%. But we're actually seeing it perform quite well against some of the meta decks. One of the biggest problems for Han, however, still remains Boba, as all 3 days over the course of it, they had a pretty losing win percentage, kind of totaling around 38 to 40% as far as my look goes, but it does perform really well against Sabine red. And again, this is mainly Han green that we're seeing, and that's most likely due to just how powerful the threats you can deploy on Han actually are, right? Getting down a Ewing reinforcement by the time, Sabine only had maybe a single turn to be on the battlefield is really, really powerful. Of course, turn 1 Millennium Falcon against Sabine Wren, if they ever go A-Wings or Red 3s, and if they ever go into the space arena, just absolutely wrecks them, right? You can go Millennium Falcon turn 1 after they play an A-Wing, which, oh my gosh, that's just an absolute nightmare for Sabine. You could bounce to your hand. You could play it again if you want to kill another 3 defense space unit, which most of them are. If they ever play Wing Leader, they're never going to get in for chip damage because it's going to get killed. So Millennium Falcon's a huge one against that. And of course, you can play things like Ezra Bridger or things that are just a little bit higher statted to kill off your opponent's units early on in the game while keep yours around. And that's really critical to keep in mind with Han. So it just does so well against Sabine. And overall, it kind of destroyed Sabine over the course of the weekend. As for the other decks, most of them were pretty even, I would say. In some cases, Darth Vader was, well, losing for Han. In some cases, it was winning. Overall, I think it was a pretty even matchup. But I think the two takeaways with Han are Sabine and Boba. Sabine being very favorable and Boba being pretty unfavorable. And, well, kind of makes sense as Han is the kind of mid-range archetype just behind Boba, and it fails against Boba. And then in Sabine's case, you can kind of outvalue their plays. In terms of the next one on our list is, well, we have some more decks to talk about. Next one's going to be Darth Vader. This is maybe my favorite deck to play as of late. It is, I think, the fourth most played as far as we can see across the weekends. Again, we're just going through these and giving a brief description. And Darth Vader here is pretty interesting to look at, as there are massive variations of Darth Vader coming in across each day. In terms of day one, or on Friday, we had a pretty crazy split in terms of bases. On Friday, we had a vast majority of the meta being Vader green, almost closer to 70% of the meta. That's 65% of the meta being Vader green, or rather, 65% close to, with a little bit of 27% blue and a 9% Vader red. So double red Vader. So Vader green on Friday. So more mid-range focus, not the control list that you're really, really seeing across Vader blue lists. On Saturday, we saw a much higher focus on Vader blue without any Vader red, which is kind of crazy. You can see here we had about a 28% Vader green, and that means we had a 72% Vader blue. And then for Friday or Sunday, we had once again another blue Vader focus, in that it was about a 57%, but we had a ton of Vader green making up the rest of the deck. So not only that, but there are some Vader green shells that are running the 30 HP base, some that are running Energy Conversion Lab. Overall, for Vader, it looks like in terms of the overall wins, Vader green was the focus, because on Saturday, which is the Vader blue focus day, they got absolutely annihilated across the board for the most part. Now, this one's a little bit interesting to see, and as we dive into more of the stats across, the next couple of days, the fact that Sabine overran Vader blue can very much happen. This is a matchup that, while Vader blue can perform against, if you stumble a little bit or you don't properly play against Sabine Wren, you will absolutely get decimated. And you can see part of that being the case here with a 12% win rate against Sabine. On the other days, when we're looking at, Vader, most of it's Vader green, and you can see the win rate against Sabine is a little bit higher, but for the most part, Sabine Wren is just usually a problem. Now, against Boba Fett, the win percentage actually increased quite a bit, specifically with Vader green in the mix, as Vader green actually does some pretty nice work against Boba Fett. One of the big things in this matchup is Vader is one of the few leaders that can't just get immediately destroyed by an ECL out steadfast battalion. So normally you can just kind of run Vader out there without too much fear of it being killed instantly, and you can actually regain control of the battlefield by that point and start to outvalue your opponent. Because unlike a lot of the other mid-range lists like Han, Luke, or even the aggressive list like Sabine, your leader just gets outclassed. And while Darth Vader comes down a lot later, he is powerful when he does come down, and he can actually compete against Boba Fett as a powerful free threat that you have in your deck, which is really, really important. But it looks like Vader green took the cake here in terms of what Vader flavor ended up being a little bit better for the weekend. And then the kind of last one that I want to talk about, as we have some other options like Leia, but that's kind of a spin-off of Sabine, a little bit weaker. And then, of course, we have some other options like Emperor Palpatine, Tarkin, Luke's, and things like that. But the other deck that we really got to talk about is, well, Krennic slash Iden. Iden was the more played of the two, but they're very, very similar in terms of what we saw out of Iden. However, you could see it is more Iden green than it is Iden blue on Saturday. Well, let's start with Friday here. On Friday, it was more Iden green than any other version of Iden. You could see we have about 20% Iden blue, 50% Iden green, and 30% Iden red. So a pretty massive split between all options, but Iden green is the clear favorite. On Saturday, we had a much more heavy Iden blue, as it was a 38% Iden blue with a 51% Iden green and a much lower percentage of Iden red. So more controlling focused. And then on Sunday, we had, well, the most Iden blue out of all the days. We had a total of 57% Iden blue with about a 28% Iden green and a 14% Iden red. So Iden green still the favorite overall in terms of the weekend, but Iden blue definitely increasing in popularity. And overall, it looks like control decks got more and more popular over the course of 3 days. Maybe that's because the meta shaped up so that people thought control decks were good, or maybe just different people showed up and they wanted to play more controlling styles. Overall, though, Iden had a very impressive win rate as well. Now, again, this is just kind of the same deck for the most part as Krennic, except in general, a little bit more better situated against the aggro decks. It does really quite well against your Boba Yellows and against your Sabines. And you could see basically across all 3 days, they did very nicely against Sabine. In some of the days, they struggled a little bit against Boba, but that's also why Boba Fett is one of the top meta. But Sabine had a huge problem dealing with Iden overall. And this makes a lot of sense as, I mean, if you look at Sabine's action and then you look at Iden's action, it's almost like hitting a brick wall, right? They do kind of the exact opposite, except you get your base damage with Sabine. And in fact, what ends up happening with Iden is because you're able to kind of heal up and use these cards and get a little bit more value and kind of ramp out, you generally speaking can just defeat your opponent before they can defeat you almost every single time because of the extra damage that they're dealing to their base while you're healing up, and you have, generally speaking, a little bit more powerful threats to back you up. But overall, Iden performed very, very well. And we could mention Krennic, which again was mainly Krennic green, but it is very, very similar in terms of what we saw. In terms of, matchups, it did pretty well against Sabine. It also did reasonably against Boba. For the most part, these decks are basically the same deck. It's just whether or not you prefer Krennic or Iden as a leader, and both have their advantages. Krennic is, your list that's going to be able to run Steadfast Battalion to a greater effect, as you can get Krennic out a little bit earlier and ECL to Steadfast Battalion. And of course, an earlier to deploy leader can be a little bit more advantageous against some of the aggro matchups, which works well. And the same thing goes for Leia in terms of comparing her to Sabine. You're going to see a lot of Leia reds, basically exclusively Leia reds. There's not really any Leia yellows or Leia greens running around. And unfortunately, Leia had a pretty unfavorable matchup, especially against Han over the course of the weekend. And that's mainly because, well, as I mentioned earlier, Han has some very powerful threats just absolutely wreck your board over the course of a few turns. But for the most part, what are we seeing? We're seeing Boba Fett, we're seeing Sabine, we're seeing Vader, we're seeing Idens, we're seeing Hans, and these are the top meta decks. There are different flavors that are actually performing quite well, and it'll be interesting to see as we dive into the statistics on which one actually took the top winning percentage and which one actually ended up being the most powerful over the course of the weekend. But that's going to take a little bit of time as I break down all the statistics. So stay tuned, guys, and I'll have that video coming out soon. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all for that video.